We have to get rid of the nuclear weapons, and we need to work together to move away from fossil fuels quickly. We need a global response, but in particular, this issue of nuclear weapons, that's what I was doing in Russia is exactly what our leadership should be doing right now, and desperately needs to do. And as a first order of business, we need an immediate ceasefire in Ukraine.
Dr. Stein, thank you so much for joining me today.
Great to be with you, Artie.
Yeah, so you're an activist, you are a physician, and you are a 3-time presidential candidate for the Green Party. I think a lot of people are familiar with you, but if there are any listeners that might not be, anything else you'd like them to know about you?
I describe myself as a mother on fire, trying to make the world safe for my children and all children, because no kids, are an island unto themselves. In the words of James Baldwin, all children belong to all of us everywhere. And as a medical doctor, I transitioned from clinical medicine to political medicine, realizing that politics is the mother of all illnesses, and it's hard to fix what's literally killing us without dealing with the corruption and dysfunction of our political system. And when I mean what's literally killing us, that's everything from pollution to poverty to war and, everything that goes along with that.
You said politics is the mother of what?
Of all illnesses.
Mother of all illnesses. Okay. Yeah, I think I agree with that. I'm into politics because it matters, but I hate it because of what it is. So I can definitely respect that analysis of it. One of the things I would like to talk about today is kind of have the veil lifted a little bit to see behind the scenes and what's really going on with our elections and third-party candidates and stuff like that. And it's kind of hard to go into that without bringing up a few of the attacks that have been hurled your way over the years. And I recently talked to a friend who is a Democrat, and when I mentioned that I'd be interviewing you, he brought up an attack that the Democratic Party has had on you about being a Russian agent. And I looked into it. I said, well, is there any merit to it? And then I looked into it myself, and there doesn't appear to be. Like, you were at an RT dinner in 2014-15 where Putin was at, but you were also giving a speech that was critical of Russia at that time. And aside from that, it looks like just an attack because you crossed a certain person in the Democratic Party in the 2016 election. And she has a habit of labeling people who cross her Russian agents. Is there anything you would like to say about that to give your side of the story beyond what I've just offered?
Well, I would add that because of that smear campaign that very much was coming from the DNC, that led to an investigation by the Senate Intelligence Committee. So I was actually investigated for 3 years, and they found absolutely nothing of merit. So anyone who goes there really should know the end of the story, which was that there was absolutely no there whatsoever. And that's kind of smear campaign is really what that is about. And in this election, the DNC actually had what they called a war room, which was for the sole purpose of smearing and pushing back independent and alternative candidates. Now, why would they do that? They're doing that because this is what the American people are really clamoring for before the election. And I think we're seeing that now big time in the aftermath of the election as well. And for the past several election cycles, certainly since 2016, the main motivator that people have in coming to elections is to vote against the person they hate the most instead of voting for what we want. And democracy really requires an explicit debate and a dialogue and a vision forward. You can't get to where you want to go simply by avoiding this obstacle or that obstacle and reacting against it. You have to be going somewhere. Otherwise, you're kind of going all over the place and backwards. And, to look at the crises that really fill our lives right now, pretty much every dimension of our lives, whether it's, over 60% of Americans living paycheck to paycheck, over half of Americans struggling to keep a roof over their heads, to make their rent or to pay their mortgage, student debt, which, some 43 million people are swamped with, medical debt, the health crisis that we are in, worse in this country than really in any developed country. We live shorter and sicker lives than any other developed country, even though we spend twice as much per person on healthcare. Things are not working. And let me say, we squander half of our congressional budget on the endless war machine, which does not make us safer, which in fact is seriously putting us all in the target hairs right now of the growing escalation towards nuclear war. So, per household, it was something like $12,000 last year. If you add up, this is according to Jeffrey Sachs and his number crunching, the economist from Columbia University, it's about $12,000 per household that we are paying for this massive, vicious war machine, for which the draft has now been reenacted as well. Many people don't know that, but we actually now have a draft, and you're in it if you are between the ages of 18 and 25 and you're a male. You are in that list, and all it takes is for the White House to say, oh, we need some boots on the ground to help us, fight this war or that war. Doesn't matter. They're coming for you and they know where to find you. So our lives are in crisis right now. Our resources, our financial resources, and potentially, our young men are very much on the firing line now of this intensive war machine. And our elected officials are bought and paid for. And we see that over and over again, especially by the war machine, by AIPAC, by the weapons contractors. This is where our dollars are going instead of going into what we actually need, including, the things I mentioned, healthcare, housing, education, also the climate crisis, which continues to really spin out of control right now. So on all those fronts, we are being betrayed by our elected officials, and they work really hard, especially the Democrats, to suppress other voices, to silence other voices, to prevent us from getting on the ballot, even while some 60% roughly of Americans are screaming for other choices in the presidential election. That's been the case for maybe the last 5 or 6 years, maybe even longer than that. But it's been quite a while now that people have been really clamoring for other choices. And then to hear a debate around what the crises are and how do we solve them. And the Democrats, pulled out all the stops in the last election with this war room where they were spending more on smearing us than our entire budget for our entire campaign. They had 30 staffers, which was more than we had, just for the purpose of smearing us. So they're running scared, as they should. Their days are numbered, and the American people have already dropped out, I think, of the duopoly. The largest identification is with no party. It's with independents. It's about twice as many as people who identify as independent as there are who consider themselves Republican or Democrat. So this is why the powers that be rely now on just silencing their opposition, because they are terrified that people should actually discover that there are candidates out there that actually represent the critical needs that we're facing every day in our lives.
Yeah. It's infuriating to see the word democracy invoked by people who are actively trying to hinder the democratic process. And I recently watched an interview with Mike Benz on Joe Rogan's podcast, and he talked about the intelligence apparatus and kind of what they've put in place. It's actually starting with the war in Ukraine, not the 2021 war in Ukraine, but the initial the coup that the United States did in Ukraine, which if you talk about that, you get, that's Russian propaganda, even though it's factually true. But the coup in Ukraine, they started really keeping an eye on the internet dialogue and stuff like that, and shutting down speech that didn't go along with what I don't even want to say the West, but what the intelligence apparatus of the West wanted to do. And what he revealed in that conversation was that these institutions, because it's not just like CIA, NSA, it's actually these NGOs that are attached to these intelligence apparatus, and they define democracy as the institutions, not the people. And when you're talking about democracy, you're very much talking about the people. The people need to say, the people need to have their voices heard. How do you combat that when democracy is being defined so differently by the people who are constantly talking about protecting democracy?
I think that myth is one of many. We live in a sea of disinformation, including that, the economy's doing great and inflation has gone away. And, we're in an economic boom, or that, student debt doesn't exist. The healthcare crisis doesn't exist. We're living in this absurd world. Given the recent, shooting and murder of the health insurance CEO, suddenly there's all this recognition. Wow, there's a healthcare crisis out there, and many people are really resentful. And hello, this is like the nature of people's lives. This is among many reasons why voices like mine were being suppressed, because we are reflecting, that desperate need. To my mind, we live in an ocean of disinformation. This last election was the most, what's the term Chomsky used? Manufactured consent. This was manufactured consent in the extreme. And the real crises of people's lives, which is not only healthcare, but also housing. We're living in an incredible housing crisis. And the statistics actually show that half of all Americans, especially those who rent, are very precariously, housed at this point and are living within one or two paychecks of evictions. People are really living in crisis, and there's a pretense that it's not. And if you have a problem, it's you, which is the problem, as opposed to the system. So, I think we live in a fake world that it makes people crazy right now, and makes you think you're crazy if you're not liking it. And it's all about divide and conquer. And, politics has been thoroughly hijacked by big money. In, I think 2012, at any rate, I know we had $1 billion presidential campaigns, each of them. This time around, and I haven't seen the figures on paper, but, just hearing it referenced in a radio broadcast, it's, we're more on the order of $1.5 billion. And I don't know if that even includes the dark money and the super PACs and things like that. So much money is pouring in from deeper pockets than ever. And it's coming in these unaccountable bundles. So you don't even know who's paying for it. So our political system is not capable. That is the duopoly, the traditional politics. It's paid for by billionaires and bankers and the health insurance industry and the war contractors and APAC. So everyday people are not reflected whatsoever in the political agenda. And I think it's really important for people to, to basically turn a blind eye to this shower of propaganda that we are dosed with, 24/7, really. It's really important to get off of the mainstream media and to start exploring independent politics and true journalists like yourself, who are not bought and paid for and who aren't just spouting the talking points of, of the military industrial complex and Wall Street. So I think it's really important to recognize that we are immersed in propaganda intended to tell you that resistance is futile, because the powers that be are terrified that you should discover that you are in very good company. And in fact, the majority of Americans really want a very substantively changed system, which is not bought and paid for by big money. In fact, a political system that truly does reflect what voters urgently need, and which allows for debate and which allows for diverse choices. And that way the system will, it can self-correct. Right now, it's not capable of self-correcting because, look at the Democrats just had a very big loss. And what are they making of it? They're trying to figure out, who to blame next. But that's about as far as it goes. And they made the same mistakes that they've made before. They've essentially spoiled the election for themselves by abandoning working people, people of color, immigrants. The traditional Democratic base is not being served by the Democratic Party, and that hasn't been true for a very long time. The traditional positions of the Democratic Party to have been, the party of peace, or at least to have some resistance to the endless war machine, to support free speech, supporting low-income working people, it's not there anymore. So you see the traditional demographics now either staying home in huge numbers. 1 out of every 3 eligible voters, in fact, more than that, chose not to vote in this election, also in 2020. Mm-hmm. So what used to be the progressive demographic is not coming out to vote. And many of those who are no longer voting Democratic out of desperation. They're voting Republican, not because they understand or support the viewpoints of Donald Trump, but because they're very disgusted and sick and tired of being thrown under the bus by Democrats who promise to raise the minimum wage, but at the end of the day wouldn't even take a vote on a $15 an hour minimum wage. They promise a public health insurance option so that we can afford our health care. That got dropped. Relieving student debt and bailing out students, that got dropped. Free public higher education, that got dropped. One thing after another, people have just had it, being thrown under the bus. That's fundamentally why Democrats are losing. And, this blather about, being a democracy and some more supporting democracies around the world. Yeah, right. Like Israel, like Saudi Arabia, like Egypt, these countries are just, swimming in human rights abuses. So we are not a force for democracy. We are basically a force for the empire that the U.S. has become at your expense, because it's your tax dollars that are paying for these bombs and this slaughter all around the world. Since the Second World War, we have exercised regime change, largely through the CIA, in some 80 countries around the world. This is not democracy, going out and just overthrowing countries because you don't like their policies, largely, if they are resisting U.S., economic corporate takeovers, or if they are going to meet the needs of their people. Guatemala, for example, had a democratically elected president, this was in the 1950s, who was going to redistribute land to the peasants so that people who were impoverished for generations could have, a fighting chance at a decent life. So the CIA went in at the request of United Fruit, which was the big landowner, a corporation in another country, to overthrow the democratically elected government of Guatemala, which then threw Guatemala into basically a series of civil wars that has lasted, well over 50, 60 years. Now they have a hope of a democracy in their last election, but I'm not sure where things stand at the moment. So we're in the business of sowing chaos around the world, creating endless wars, failed states like Libya, for example, and many of the other countries where we overturn their governments, continuing mass refugee migrations, and continuing terrorist threats. And now this is all very much coming back to bite us in these conflicts that we're locked in now with this very aggressive foreign policy that, it has a name. The Pentagon calls it full spectrum dominance. We are accustomed to dominating all areas of potential competition, whether it's economic, military, cyber, etc. We are the self-defined dominant power. It's not working out for us because there is a whole now rising alternative in the global south, the BRIC nations, which are growing rapidly in their numbers, and they account now for the majority of the world's GDP. And you add together their nuclear weapons and their other military, and we're not long for this world if we're insisting on dominating everyone. We need to move to a collaborative, multipolar world based on international law, human rights, and diplomacy, instead of this current foreign policy we have, which is basically to dominate everyone. So this democracy nonsense is just cover for a host of ills that are coming back to bite us in a big way.
Yeah. I know I have some things regarding policy I don't completely align with you, but I'm very anti-war. That's probably one of my biggest priorities when it comes to international politics. Like, we just stay in our own lane, don't get into everyone's business. It has been disastrous every time we've done it. We end up footing a bill, and we don't even get what we propose to bring to these countries, often saying democracy, like you said, but we don't bring democracy. We bring destruction. Like Iraq, I read a book about Iraq from somebody who lived there, and it was not that Saddam Hussein was a good leader at all, but prior to him taking over from his uncle, like, it was actually a very nice place to live. Like, the living standard was probably lower than the US, but it was still like it was a modern society until, obviously Saddam messed that up a bit too, but then we came in and we made it a third world country for sure. And it's just horrible to see this. And obviously we're paying for it, the US citizens. We have to pay for all these wars and everything like that. So I completely agree with you with our foreign policy. It seems like, China is probably our biggest economic threat, and probably militarily too, but they seem to be playing the long game. And the long game is really just let us keep doing what we're doing, because we will push ourselves out of competition, essentially. Do you agree with that?
Yes. Yeah. China is playing a very long game, and they're not wasting their resources on, conflicts all around the world. According to the Brown University Cost of War Project, we have basically special operations now, military special ops going on in 85 countries around the world. And we have 800 bases in almost every country around the world, every country that's not kind of defined as our adversary. And we're spending half of our discretionary budget on that. In China, that's not where they put their dollars. Their military budget is, I think it's like 1/3 the size of ours. So we're the giant. Our military budget is larger than the next 10 biggest military spenders all combined. And China is very focused on development, and they don't send troops, they send construction crews, and they tend to meet the needs that developing countries are really struggling with. So they have a far more successful foreign policy at this point as well. So, yeah, instead of just regarding them as a threat, we need to learn from them and also be playing, a long game. And, China basically, I don't know if they completely eliminated poverty, but they did the most massive economic uplift ever in recorded history in terms of, eliminating poverty in their country. So, they have a mixed economy, but it's doing a pretty good job. It's not flawless by any means. And they have their crises as well. But in general, people are flourishing in China, and they're not wasting their money on wars. I think their last war was with Vietnam, if I'm not mistaken, way back, in the time of the Vietnam and Korean War era. They, they're careful.
Yeah.
And for us to define our economic competitors as enemies is disastrous. And, I must say, for Donald Trump now to be relying on tariffs is really hard. It's not only not going to work, but it's a disaster for the American taxpayer, because tariffs are essentially a hidden tax. And if he is imposing tariffs on China and Mexico and Canada, which was the last I heard, if I'm not mistaken, that covers a lot of American goods, and it doesn't really provide American industry with the support that it needs. You can't just put up a barrier and think that, industry is going to flourish in this country. It's going to take more than that. But putting up barriers, tariffs is a disaster for the American people. We're going to see inflation, really skyrocketing under that kind of a regime.
With tariffs, I'm just barely starting to learn a little bit about the history of tariffs, and I heard somebody say that the U.S. GDP or income, I don't know what it would be, but most of the revenue for the U.S. used to be tariffs prior to World War I.
Mm.
And then we implemented an income tax, and then we've just increased that tax over the years until we have what we have now. Why are tariffs so bad now if that's how we brought in money prior to income tax? Because it seems like tariffs would be okay if we got rid of the income tax. Because if you're just collecting it from the U.S., then you're giving all these foreign companies the ability to not get charged any tax, and then you're putting all of it on the American citizens. Versus if you put tariffs on and eliminated the income tax, then you would be taxing U.S. citizens, but you would also be collecting some of that from those foreign companies. So I am curious, why is it so bad now compared to 120 years ago?
So the problem with tariffs is that it gets passed on to the consumer, because the cost of goods basically goes up to compensate for the loss of income. So tariffs are essentially a tax that gets passed on to the consumer, and it is a flat tax. In other words, it's not proportional to your ability to pay, or to, so low income people wind up paying a much bigger portion of their income. The higher you go, see, we have such a skewed income distribution over the last, this has always been the case, but it's really gotten extreme in recent years, where the income at the higher end, like in the 1%, and in particular, it's the 0.1%, where income has massively skyrocketed.
Yeah.
But they have so much influence in the political system that they really don't pay it back. So that money winds up being hoarded, and it stays in that 1% effectively, and especially the 0.1%. Money stays there. And it's money that is essentially deprived of low-income people who are facing growing costs of living, but an absolutely stagnant income level for decades. Actually, you can go back to the 1960s, and income adjusted for inflation, is not increased at all. But the cost of living, the cost of rent, the cost of housing, the cost of healthcare, it has skyrocketed. So you're seeing this incredibly skewed income distribution. And when you have a flat tax, it's a negligible Like it's nothing in terms of the income of the super rich. And the super rich are not spending money of necessity. So they tend not to spend money. It's a very small fraction of their money that gets spent. So if you're relying on a sales tax or and effectively tariffs are sales tax for the most part. It's a tax on goods. You're really squeezing working people who are really squeezed to start with and are living in debt already at a time when what you pay on interest and on your credit cards and things like that has also skyrocketed. So the screws are really being put on low-income people and especially on young people who are entering the economy at a time that's very difficult. And the wages that young people, there's this incredible generational inequality right now. And young people do not have a fighting chance. And like you're told, you got to go to college or at least to technical school. So you have some skills, so you have a good income. Well, guess what? Then you're saddled with debt. And the jobs that are out there now that are open do not pay enough to pay back your debt. So we're in this vicious cycle of growing inequality. And with inequality, and well, let me say more. It's not so much the inequality, it's the concentrated wealth. Concentrated wealth buys political power. Who is it that's financing, the super PACs and all the rest? So they get even more tax breaks. So they're not paying taxes at all. And and we need to have a tax system that enables our economy to function. It doesn't function now. We have a consumer-driven economy, but most consumers are not able to spend now. They don't have the discretionary income to do it. So we're in a tailspin economically, and it's getting worse. And what Trump is proposing by way of tariffs is really going to make it severely worse. And we're going to see, and also his deportation policies. So, get rid of migrant workers, get rid of immigrants, and you're going to see the cost of food absolutely go through the roof. And, it's food inflation that's really hitting people, where it hurts over the last, 3-4 years. Food inflation, it's like up 100%. It's big time, and it's going to get much worse. And we're hearing this from the food industry themselves, that deportations are going to be an absolute disaster for the food industry. Now add that together with growing climate instability, because we got drought big time. And the Colorado River in particular is about to disappear, because the Colorado River depends on water in, I think, Lake Mead, this huge reservoir in Colorado. And that reservoir is now almost below the level at which the water can come out. Why does the Colorado River matter? Because that's the whole California agriculture system that supplies half the fruits and vegetables for the whole nation. So the drought, which is really well established now, it's not getting better. It's widely recognized that this is a disaster scenario. And we're just a year or two away from, effectively a shutdown of the Colorado River. So we do have a climate emergency that translates into an impending, food emergency that's going to dovetail then with the deportations of migrants. And we're going to really see the price of food going up in this country.
When it comes to non-citizens, there's non-citizens that work in the food industry, and obviously I have trouble working this out in my mind, because on the one hand, they're making food prices lower, but they're also adding massive profits to massive corporations that are just not paying them well. But then on the other hand, isn't there an increase in healthcare costs and insurance costs? Because like if somebody who's a non-citizen goes to an ER, the ER has to take care of them, but they're not going to get paid. And likewise, if somebody who doesn't have a driver's license, doesn't have insurance, gets in a car accident, flees the scene, those costs have to be absorbed into the system somehow. So they're being paid for by people who do have insurance, people who do have health insurance, stuff like that. Isn't there an increased cost elsewhere? And
So
does that?
that's a really important issue, and I'm glad you raised it because there's a lot of disinformation out there. But the reality is that immigrants pay taxes. They pay taxes on their earnings. They pay property taxes if they have a place to live. They are full taxpayers. They're paying Social Security taxes. They're paying in, though they largely don't take out. If they have kids in the school system, yeah, they'll be in the school system. But if they are working, there is a huge economic benefit to the economy. In fact, it's estimated, the last report I saw said it's something like $7 trillion. I mean, it's a huge amount that immigrants are generating over the coming decade. So immigrants who work, the question is whether immigrants are working. If they're not working, then yes, then they are a net cost to the community. That's fixable. And let me just say, to go back to the first causes, we want to stop pushing people to have to migrate. Why are people migrating to this country? People are migrating to this country because we've made a mess. It's largely related to U.S. foreign policy and also to the economic, the predatory economic policies of U.S. corporations, Ecuador, Honduras. When we establish U.S. domination, or look at Guatemala. It was United Fruit that wanted service in Guatemala, and the chaos that ensued after overthrowing Guatemala's government has, created just a steady stream of migrants who are fleeing the chaos of destabilized societies related to regime change operations, related to sanctions, like on Cuba and Nicaragua, Venezuela. Destabilizing those economies pushes people to flee because otherwise their families are going to starve, and they're going to starve. So how about we just stop pushing people out of their homes to start with? And there are and also U.S. drug policy is a part of that too, because by sponsoring this war on drugs in this country and overseas, or not overseas, but across the border in particular, we're creating violence of the drug cartels. And through treating drug use as a public health problem rather than a criminal problem in this country and south of the border, we can immediately remove one of the major drivers of the violence pushing migration. So we need an upfront solution. Prevention is worth a pound of cure, and more than that in this case. So that's one piece, is that we need to address that problem at its source and massively ramp down the pressures to migrate. Because if you talk to immigrants, they didn't want to move. They didn't want to come here. They came here basically to save their lives and the lives of their family. They came here to get out of the poverty so that they could feed their families. And it's usually related to destabilizing policies that the U.S. has inflicted on them. So that's number one. And then number two, the wall doesn't do any good. The wall does not keep drugs out. It just increases deaths, and it's also very harmful to wildlife, which need to migrate, and the flow of water and so on. So the wall is a disaster. It doesn't work. Drugs come into the country through portals of entry, and they're largely coming in through red-blooded Americans, not immigrants. It's not immigrants. So that's all a myth. That's all basically smear campaigns against migrants to get people focused on someone to blame it on. It's scapegoating as opposed to looking at really the problems in our economy and in U.S. policies. That's what we need to fix. And migrants are a convenient scapegoat. They always have been, by wealthy elites who want to scapegoat migrants and not have to talk about how the wealthy elites are the ones who are ripping us off, not the migrants. But all this nonsense about migrants being violent, no, they actually have a much lower crime rate. They make our communities safer. And in fact, if they're working, they are a net positive They're actually financing their communities, and they are more than paying their own way. So instead of spending billions of dollars on this boondoggle of a wall, which is basically just corporate welfare for the construction and security companies, instead of that, we need adequate civil, servants, the attorneys, people doing background checks, et cetera, so that we process people. We massively reduce the numbers who are coming, and then we put resources into truly effective screening so people get processed and they get their papers so they can go to work. This was like how it used to be done in Ellis Island. That's what we need. We need to properly screen people so that people are not coming who are fleeing, fleeing the law, or who have records of violent crime. People are screened adequately, and then they're promptly moved in and able to go to work. And that's how we basically eliminate this crisis of migration.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think we need to be better about processing legal immigration. Like, I think immigrants add to our economy, definitely. When it comes to illegal immigration, if you have 1 million people cross the border illegally, come into the U.S. illegally, and let's say 10,000 are criminals, which is a fairly small percent. Like, is that 1%, 10%, 1%? 1% are criminals, which is a fairly small percentage. Those 10,000 can give everyone else a really bad name. So if we're vetting everyone and keeping those 10,000 out, the problem is largely fixed. So I agree with you on streamlining that and getting that faster. When it comes to actually helping these countries that the immigration is coming from, aside from just staying out of their business and not, regime change, all the horrible things that we've done, is there anything else that we can do? Because it seems like the aid, and I put that in quotes, aid that we send to countries is usually just, I'm sure some reaches people, but it's mostly money laundering in my opinion.
Oh, it is. And most of it is it's military,
Yeah.
It's military aid, and it's a very targeted kind of economic aid for big corporations. So
Yeah.
it's not, that kind of aid is not helpful whatsoever. I think if aid is carefully targeted and monitored so that it actually is benefiting ordinary people and helping to stabilize their economies, that's useful. I think also helping to combat climate change because, and climate adaptation, because drought is a huge cause of migration now among farmers. Millions of farmers have been put out of work by drought.
Yeah.
And, getting our own house in order so that we're not, the Democrats give a lot of lip service to what they're doing on climate, but actually all they're doing is externalizing our emissions. So if you actually look at fossil fuel extraction in this country, it has massively skyrocketed more under Democrats than under Republicans, although the Democrats will finger point at Republicans. But in fact, fossil fuel extraction went up great. And also the assault on our public lands and extracting from fragile public land and offshore waters, it's gone up way more. In fact, this Inflation Reduction Act, which the Democrats point to and pat themselves on the back, and they talk about what a great bill it is. It's actually a fossil fuels first bill. It has some, renewable energy around the margins, but mostly what it does is subsidize fossil fuel and expedite fossil fuels. You may remember how Kamala Harris bragged that she opened the floodgates for fracking through the Inflation Reduction Act. And in fact, the Inflation Reduction Act mandates that before any renewable projects can be sponsored, any major renewable projects can be built, which are all basically on public land. You're not going to take over private land for a renewable project. They're made mainly on public land or offshore waters. You can't do any of that until you first auction off 60 million acres of public land onshore, 60 million every year. and I think it's 2 million offshore every year. So you have to massively subsidize growing fossil fuel extraction before you can do anything renewable. So it's really a BS bill. It's a bill, this is why we need alternative candidates and alternative parties who will critique this, because the Democrats and Republicans, they're in cahoots on genocide, on endless war, on endless military subsidies. They're in cahoots, and they won't debate it. They won't critique it. They won't point out that the Pentagon has not passed an audit, in the last 6 or 7 attempts. I don't know if it ever passed an audit, but certainly not in recent times. It's been unable to account for where does its money go.
Yeah.
And hello, if there's ever a red flag for corruption and theft, that's it. That's it.
Yeah.
This Doge agency headed by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, they're looking for efficiencies. This is, the greatest efficiency. It's well over $1 trillion a year that we are spending on this endless war machine. And what do we get for it? We get more war and, endless migrations and continuing terrorist threats. So, and failed states. That's what we're getting, with our $1 trillion military budget. So, yeah.
I even have some skepticism around, we talk about the military budget and we compare it to other countries, but when we have our healthcare system in the U.S., our administrative costs are 3 or 4 times that of every other country, every other developed country. So when I hear about the budget, the military budget, I know we have the largest military, but I don't know if it's 3 times the size of China's just because we spend 3 times the amount of money, Like, is that money, because if they're being more efficient with their 1/3 of the budget than we are, and we have people taking kickbacks through every step of the stage, like, do we actually have that big of a military compared to everyone else? Like, if we're measuring it by budget, is that really a good measure for us? I don't think it is.
I think, you're right. In that, are we getting the bang for our buck? No way, because brute military force is not going to solve problems for us. We, in the words of John F. Kennedy, we must not negotiate out of fear, but we must not fear to negotiate. And if you look at what's going on in Ukraine right now, not even to mention that Russia just demonstrated that it has now missiles that absolutely leave us in the dust. I don't know if you've heard about this new.
It starts with a C. I can't remember it. What is it?
It's called the Oreshnik.
Oreshnik.
The Oreshnik is the one that's been demonstrated. That's an intermediate range, which could hit anywhere in Europe, and it can't be stopped. The whole anti-missile system was a fraud to start with, but now it's really, really a fraud. It might have hit a few of its targets before. This was, whistleblowers from inside that world have been blowing the whistle on missile defense for a long time. And now Russia has rockets that cannot be stopped, period. And in fact, when they did their demonstration run with the Oreshnik, this was like 3 weeks ago, something like that, which hit a munitions factory in Ukraine. They warned people like a half hour beforehand. They said, everybody get out of the way because we're going to show you what we have now. And they can give warnings about this well in advance because there are no anti-missiles that can touch it. They can't. And it's traveling at something like 10 times the speed of sound, Mach 10, but actually even more than that. And that's just their intermediate range, which could hit anywhere in Europe. And then they also have a long range, which could come here. And I don't know if that one has been demonstrated yet, but it's reported by journalists from outside of Russia that these things are there and they're ready to go and they exist and they've been tested. So what are we getting exactly for our expenditures? The system is that corrupt that it's buying garbage. It's buying a lot of garbage. It's basically, corporate boondoggles. It's a red flag for that. If you can't pass a an audit, there are serious concerns about what you're buying and where that money is going.
I agree. And we have some arrogant people when it comes to war. Obviously, the politicians that are war hawks, but then we also have citizens that just believe that the U.S. is so militarily strong that no one can even hold a candle to us. And it's like, I hate that rhetoric because war is disgusting. It's horrible. I don't believe there are winners other than the military-industrial complex in wars. And you don't know, as we're seeing with is it Oreshnik? Is that
Oreshnik,
Oreshnik?
yes.
As we're seeing with stuff like that, you don't know what somebody has
Yeah,
for a
right.
war until the war happens. And you don't want to find out. Like, it's just, I mean, in World War I, we saw tanks. And World War II, we saw fighter jets, stuff like that. Like, you don't know the technology that people have been working on until you're in it.
Yes.
And you don't want to see that because the devastation, the weapons that we can build now are so destructive that, I mean, we are looking at an end of the world scenario if we have a nuclear war. I mean, it's done. I don't know if humanity can survive that. And yeah, it's just not
Exactly.
something.
And the system is hardwired now so that once it begins, it's almost impossible to stop. You
Yeah.
have these automatic launches of, if Russia has a system called Dead Hand, and I'm sure we have a counterpart to it,
Hmm.
though I don't know that that's been identified. But if Russia's got it, you can be pretty sure we've got it because it's been known for a long time.
Yeah.
They have a system called Dead Hand, whereby if you decapitate their command and control, if you decapitate Moscow, you knock out Moscow, everything launches. Everything launches. And it's, like 1,000 missiles, which have multiple warheads. We're gone. The Earth is gone. And I don't know if you know of a guy named Scott Ritter, he was the nuclear weapons inspector working for the UN.
Mm.
And he's the guy who said, no, there's no weapons of mass destruction. Don't launch
Yeah.
that war. They do not exist. They do not have weapons of mass destruction. He blew the whistle. So, of course, he got fired because he would have stopped the war on Iraq and then everything that devolved from there, which is some, 4.5 million deaths, innocent civilians basically caught in the crossfire of that first of the post 9/11 wars, and then others downstream from that. But so Scott Ritter, he's still around, and he is still a watchdog, a very much reviled and disparaged watchdog because he does tell it like it is. He's a military guy.
Yeah.
And he and other military guys, including Larry, I'm forgetting his last name, but the guy who was Colin Powell's chief of staff, the two of them, together with the major rocket scientist named Ted Postal, who was the MIT, professor of rocket science and nuclear security, they are on a tear right now. They did a really excellent forum last week at the Washington Press Club this past weekend called, what was it called? I think No Nuclear War, I believe. You can Google it or just Google Scott Ritter and No Nuclear War. Larry Wilkerson is the name of the other. These are like two military guys. And then the scientist who is advising the military, Ted Postal, doing a kind of an expose about where we stand with this now escalating threat of nuclear war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And it's been triggered by many things have laid the groundwork for this, including that the U.S. backed out of treaties. The U.S. backed out of nuclear treaties.
Yeah.
And most recently, this short range, they're called intermediate range, but they're, it's like the missiles that are the shortest missiles out there, because you're not going to strike, a place 5 miles from you, you'll blow yourself up. So it's intermediate range are the shortest range missiles. And that's what would hit anywhere in Europe. You can hit anywhere in Europe. And these are the missiles that the U.S. just basically gave permission to Ukraine to use. We not only said, go ahead and use these short range missiles, but we'll operate them for you because they're difficult to operate. It takes a lot of training. So the U.S. is basically doing command and control on these missile strikes inside of Russia now. So technically, we are at war with Russia, and Russia just said, "Stop those missiles." Russia's been in a defensive posture here. Its assault on Ukraine is illegal and criminal, but still, it was provoked. It's been provoked. We ourselves were in a very similar position when we discovered Russian missiles in Cuba. This is like the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
What did we do when we discovered those missiles? We launched our nuclear warplanes. So we were ready to go with nuclear war. We didn't go to nuclear war because we had leaders who were ready to sit down and negotiate. And that's what Kennedy and Khrushchev did, and they averted nuclear war.
Yeah.
We then, developed some treaties to help reduce the risk. But, there has always been terrific risk. These weapons need to be abolished because they can wipe us out like that.
Yeah.
And the U.S. abolished the few safeguards that we have. That's why Russia has these new missiles. They would not have them, and they would not be able to use them if we still had that treaty. So we need, as a first order of business, we need to get that treaty back in order. This is the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. We need to do that because the risks are accelerating. Right now, the U.S., is using these missiles against Russia. Russia just demonstrated how they can fight back. And, they just wiped out a munitions factory. There was no way to stop their missiles. And they said, if you keep coming at us, we are going to respond in kind, and we're going to escalate our response. So the next response, if we keep hitting Russia, could be for Russia to take out some of the NATO missiles that are along Russia's border, which is what Russia has a problem with. It has a problem with nuclear compatible missiles on its border, the same problem we had. So we know what's going on here. We should not be, disparaging or failing to believe that Russia is very serious. They do not want nuclear missiles on their border. And all of us need to get down to the business of signing on to the nuclear ban treaty. That's why I was in Russia at the RT conference, not only to critique Russia bombing Syria, but especially to say, we have to get rid of the nuclear weapons, and we need to work together to move away from fossil fuels quickly. We need a global response, but in particular, this issue of nuclear weapons, that's what I was doing in Russia is exactly what our leadership should be doing right now, and, desperately needs to do. And as a first order of business, we need an immediate ceasefire in Ukraine, and we need to stop these use of the so-called intermediate range missiles. We have to stop making war on Russia, because Russia has bigger missiles than we do, and we all got nuclear weapons. And, Russia's policy is that if they have an existential threat, they will use a nuclear weapon. Okay. So let's say they take out, a NATO facility. Technically, then everybody's at war with Russia because of that fifth clause, chapter, whatever it is in NATO that says a war against one is a war against all. So we can see this escalate, just faster than you can blink an eye. But it's really clear this is not rocket science, no pun intended. This is really simple. Really simple. We just we need a ceasefire, and then we need to ban nuclear weapons and get the INF Treaty back in order quickly. Yeah. But our leadership is brain dead. They're criminal. It's an absolutely criminal set of warmongers that we have in both political parties. This was why my campaign was in the race, is to put these issues into debate, because otherwise we're not going to fix this. People don't even know what's going on. People deserve to know that we are in the target hairs. But this is really drop dead simple to fix. Yeah,
well, we need to have a nuanced conversation, and we need to have a conversation with all parties involved, because if we're this fantasy that we're going to somehow eliminate Russia it's black and white thinking, we're Russia bad, we're good, we just need to stop Russia. Like we're dealing with a nuclear power. It's not North Korea. Not that posturing against North Korea is exactly smart, but Russia's much more capable than North Korea or probably any other country as far as military. So
And
I
we're
agree
pushing
with
them
you.
all together.
Yeah,
We are creating an alliance now between North Korea, Russia, Iran, and China.
yeah,
And
yeah, and that's been happening for a while.
yeah, yeah, it's very, short-sighted is not the word. These tools of the war industry. They're
Yeah,
just creating conflicts to sell weapons, and they are brain dead. They're brain dead, and they're a danger to all of us, and they need to be removed from power as quickly as possible. How do you remove them from power? We don't have a presidential election coming up for a while.
yeah,
We have congressional elections going on all the time, and that's really important, I think, for people to support, real alternatives here who will stand up and fight this devastating imperial system, which is endangering us and it's impoverishing us. It hits us on both ends. It hits us with the danger of war, and it hits us by, usurping our public dollars, our public resources in this absolutely insane and dangerous way. So we have to stand up and fight for the alternatives, and potentially, how do you stop this train that's taking us all over the cliff now? Do we need a massive economic boycott? A day of, a sick out or a strike or something? How do we, the people, assert our power when our political system has been stolen from us?
yeah,
But we need to act with all due haste here because it's our future. And the scientists and the experts who know this stuff and who follow it, they're absolutely terrified now of the level of risk. So
yeah,
we need to act. And I encourage people to, you know, um, to find out more. You can go to my Twitter, Jill Stein, Dr. Jill Stein at Dr. No period, Jill Stein. Our website is still the campaign website. We don't have a new one up. But you can stay in touch through social media, and we will be helping to try to organize some kind of a response here because it's
yeah.
not coming from from the seat of the empire.
Yeah, well, I think your voice is important, and I reject entirely the concept of being a spoiler. I think it's all BS, and I like what you said before. It's up to the Democrats or Republicans to earn our votes, and it is not owned by them. So I
Exactly.
like what you said there. Do you think you'd be running again in 4 years?
We'll see where it goes. If not me, then, there will certainly be others. And in fact, we're very involved right now in down ballot campaigns, both for Congress, for statewide office, and, for school committees and city councils. The same problems of corruption and the buyout of big corporations of our political system. It's happening at the local level too.
Yeah,
And you know, we need alternatives and choices at the local level as well. So if
yeah,
people follow us, you can also go to gp.org to find out what's going on in your state or
yeah,
in your city, and you can follow us there, and you can also follow me and our team. We will be launching some kind of a bigger effort in the not too distant future. It won't be an electoral campaign at this point, but the problems, the crises that we're facing don't go away with the
yeah,
election, especially when the results are inside of the box that's caving in on us right now. So
yeah,
we have the power, we have the numbers, and we have an electorate that is not bought and paid for, though our leadership is. The people are not. People really agree on basic solutions. We need to get the big money out, get the people back in, have actual choices, and be able to do some mid-course corrections. Because right now we are on a trajectory for doomsday, and it's
yeah.
not that far away.
Dr. Stein, thank you so much for your time today. Anything else you'd like to share before we wrap up? Or tell people about your site? I know you already have, but anything else for people to reach you or know more about you?
Let's see. We are we continue to try to shut down the genocide in Gaza, because this is a genocide. There are terrible things going on all around the world, but this one is especially bad, and we're paying for it with our tax dollars, and we can stop it. And the American people want to stop that. Some 68% of Americans want a diplomatic solution. They want a ceasefire in Gaza, but we're looking at Israel actually now expanding into the West Bank, into Lebanon, now into Syria as well. We have the makings of another, World War III potentially, going on in the Middle East as well. So we've got many hot spots that could be exploding on us, and many people are, students, young people, and 68% of Americans want an end to the genocide. If you end the genocide, then the conflict in the Middle East, it may not go away entirely, but it really comes down orders of magnitude, and that needs to happen. The whole world wants it to happen. The American people want it to happen, and in fact, it's over 60% of Americans who want a weapons boycott to actually stop the war. We're in charge of this war. Ronald Reagan stopped Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982 just by picking up the phone, and we could do as much. So this is another hot spot that could be resolved right away. And I want to end with two quotes. One from Frederick Douglass, who said, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will." We need to be organized to make that demand as a counterweight to corporations and billionaires and bankers, because they're very well organized and they can make their demands. And then the other quote is from Alice Walker, who said, "The biggest way people give up power is by not knowing we have it to start with." We got the numbers. We share basic values of democracy, freedom, justice. We can implement policies that begin to deliver, because right now we're losing on all of those counts. We do have the numbers, like 68% that want to end the genocide in Gaza right now. We got the numbers. It's about getting organized. So I'm really grateful to independent journalists like you. Artie, thank you very much for having me on and for doing the work that you do and having the broad discussion that Americans are really hungry for. So I look forward to continuing dialogue with you and everybody out there who together, we can be an unstoppable force for good. We don't have to settle for the lesser evil. We can fight for the greater good that we actually deserve. So we have lives that are secure and stable and will be here for the next generation and generations to come.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a really great conversation with you. And it was a first for me because I voted for you in 2016. So you're the first person I've interviewed that I've actually cast a vote for. So really cool experience for me too. So Dr. Stein, thank you so much for your time. And I look forward to seeing more of what you do.
Thanks so much, Artie. Take care. All best. Be well.